Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the paneling of Zoro vs. Mr. 1. It's an iconic fight, full of great visual techniques, so I hope you'll enjoy this discussion. If you're new to my channel, the usual MO is that we go from start to finish in the fight and pick out all of the most interesting paneling techniques to break down. If you enjoy that kind of thing, then make sure to subscribe. The question I'd like to start with is, how do you draw something unbreakable? How do you show the reader that it will not bend or chip under pressure? You can try to show this in a literal way, with blades failing to go through, and with visual effects that imply a clanking sound of metal against metal. But you can also show this to the reader in a less literal way. Manga can make full use of shapes and angles to convey an abstract feeling. In the case of Mr. 1, we use right angles and rectangular shapes. These shapes are solid and stable. They don't look like they'll bend or break. His stance isn't the reason he takes no damage, it's his devil fruit. But the stance conveys the right feeling to the reader, that he's as sturdy as a mountain. Mr. 1 can't really cut things better than a guy with a sword, it's that he can't be cut that defines him as a fighter. This shape is repeated throughout the fight. It's not every panel of him, which would get repetitive, but it's a recurring motif, and it's vital for making the final page of the fight so satisfying. But before we get to that, we have a lot more action to dissect. And that starts with how Zoro challenges Mr. 1. If Mr. 1 is defined by rectangular right angles, then Zoro making a cross shape is a deliberate challenge to that. Zoro isn't making this shape all the time. It's specific to this fight as a representation of his intent to overcome Mr. 1. That's the end of a chapter. The next one begins by reinforcing the same imagery. Here, the right angles aren't just on Mr. 1, but are around him, defining his side of the fight. This shot also establishes the setting, particularly the pillar behind them that will matter later. The directional flow is similar to one we saw in Luffy vs. Buggy, where the eye moves with the protagonist's vision, showing their intent. As seen on the next page, that intent can also be conveyed across panels, not just within one. The bottom panel conveys the initial dynamic of the fight very well, a line between them to show the conflict, and each one of them taking up half the panel, showing their seemingly equal strength. Mr. 1's next move is a little confusing visually, but that's fitting. Zoro is confused by it too, because Mr. 1 isn't fighting conventionally, he's doing moves a swordsman wouldn't. The zoom in on Mr. 1's hand doesn't just emphasize how he's using his powers to attack, but also makes it feel like the hand is getting closer to us, just as it's coming toward Zoro. So when it comes toward the camera on the next page, that motion feels natural. The cool thing about the choreography here is how it's built on what each fighter's hands are doing. Both of them use both hands, and we are clearly shown where each hand is before we see what it does next. And because both hands are used up, we end the page with it looking like both hands are off to the side for both fighters, rather than between them, so neither is in a position to attack, right? But Mr. 1 is no ordinary fighter. Any limb is a blade for him. We aren't just exploring everything that can be done with his power, we are also integrating that into the flow of the fight in a visual way. You can only use the art to bait the reader into thinking he's out of limbs to attack with when writing a power like this. The circular flow here is also really cool. The eye can travel all the way around in the same motion the kick makes, then travel down with Zoro's body and go with Zoro's motion in the next panel. The next attack is set up with a zoom out, rather than a zoom in. Fitting, because Zoro is about to charge forward, so we get a sense of distance that he's about to travel. Zooming in from a very far shot of Mr. 1 to so close that we can't even see his whole face makes it feel faster than he can handle. We don't even need to see Zoro moving to get that feeling. The diagonal flow across the impact panel helps take us across Mr. 1 down to Zoro's blade, in line with the direction of the attack. I love the way the art shows us the next move. We have steady panel by panel buildup, first seeing how Zoro is in position to catch Mr. 1 as he flies backward, quickly seeing that Zoro is ready to attack, seeing the wind-up of the specific attack, and then traveling down in the same direction Zoro is swinging his sword for an incredibly satisfying follow-through. Masterful job of making it so the way the motion goes across the page matches the direction of the eye. This page is also a great example of how much panel size matters. Using the same size over and over is repetitive and dry, so unless you want it to feel that way, you want an ebb and flow between large and small. The panel of Zoro's sword is small enough to be a brief hint that he's about to attack again, before we see the full thing. But it's also small, so we move past it quickly instead of lingering on something unimportant. The full attack, on the other hand, might just be an instant in time, but the large panel makes us linger, emphasizing its importance and the power of the attack. I'm only mentioning it here, but using panel size for pacing and importance is everywhere in the fight, and everywhere in One Piece. There's also one little thing I want to note before moving on. On one side, Zoro is larger than Mr. One, but below him. On the other side, Zoro is above Mr. One, but smaller than him. Normally, this might not even be remarkable, but in context of how the fight ends, it's a very subtle piece of setup. Skipping ahead a couple pages, there's a lot of different tricks that show up on this set of pages. The eye is being directed well in many places, along Mr. One's kick or Zoro's body. We continue to have an ebb and flow between large attack panels and tight close-up panels for pacing. Mr. One is full of right angles, while Zoro's posture is unstable as hell. And the choreography lets you follow the minor changes in Zoro's position, how in order to dip lower, he's forced to use his sword arms to support himself rather than block. Right angles aren't the only angles we see for Mr. One. I like the 10-pointed star shape, for how it gives the feeling that he can be a blade in any direction. He isn't limited to just 3 like Zoro. The page is careful about what it shows and what it doesn't, hiding Mr. One's hands before showing them, and hiding what happened to Zoro until the next page. The radial lines of the composition for the attack point us toward the center, while also being so large as to dwarf the characters. Mr. One is saying here that he can attack on this scale, he can break a building. Can Zoro? Well, after his flashback, Zoro responds by showing us that yeah, he can throw part of a building. He is not outclassed just yet. The next chapter resumes right where that one left off. It's a moment frozen in time, the building floating in limbo until we're back to read it. As usual, there's great directional flow, as Zoro's arm pulls us down into the bottom panel and his blade sends up to the next. The way each character breaks the building matches their characters. Mr. One makes sturdy right angles, as methodical as he is. But Zoro? He is going to break through with raw strength. The building throw was a smokescreen the whole time. Never accuse Zoro of not being clever. The next page is like a showcase of how to align the eye in the direction of motion. The first panel has Zoro attack in the standard right-to-left flow of how a manga page is read, but the next 3 do something more complex. They set up the concept of rotational motion and guide the eye down and up into the next panel, so it doesn't start at the top right corner. This makes the eye feel like it's spinning with Zoro's blades and follows them straight into Mr. One's chin. Good fighting and good fight choreography should keep up momentum. Because Mr. One was knocked back, he has to defend with a kick. Good choreography should also explore the many ways a power can be used. Here we ask, well, if Mr. One's leg is a blade, what happens if Zoro can slide his blades up along that leg? By showing us the horizontal distance that the swords will travel, and by aligning the motion with the eye, it becomes so vivid that you can practically hear the sound of metal screeching as you read. Skipping ahead a few more pages, Zoro unfortunately loses the upper hand as Mr. One brings out his buzzsaws. This panel is similar to one we got early in the fight, split between 2 halves, but this time Zoro is in the inferior position, lower down, torso bent, Mr. One's attack above him. The momentum is shifting. In spite of their fantastical nature, One Piece fights are grounded in little physical details more often than you'd expect. Here, Mr. One is able to knock Zoro's blades aside by spreading his arms, because the buzzsaws are ridged, letting him hook onto the blades. The close-ups give Zoro and the reader a moment of horror to prepare themselves for a coming attack that he cannot dodge. The eye, of course, travels downward with Mr. One's attack, and I love the detail of 5 separate blood spurts. Who else but Oda thinks of stuff like that? The panels of the next page serve to show us where Zoro's mind is. Tight panels show broken focus and a lack of awareness of the world around him. He feels himself kneeling, without seeing how that leaves him open to getting buzzsaw jackknifed in perfect right-to-left motion. Swords flying through the air are the perfect cliffhanger, implying his state simply through what he no longer holds. Setting up the pillar at the start of the fight pays off as Zoro crashes into it, as we continue to use techniques like right-to-left motion and multiple blood spurts. One of my favorite things about One Piece's fights is how physical they are. Where characters' limbs are, where they are relative to the environment, or how they interact with that environment are all part of the fight, and they're integrated into the narrative, not just the choreography. Zoro is literally and figuratively up against a wall here. The fact that he is physically such is why when Mr. One tries to execute him, it breaks the pillar and brings the bridge down. And the collapse of the bridge is how the story transitions into Zoro's spiritual awakening as he understands the way the rocks fall. Large, silent panels pull you into the moment, give the moment's gravitas, finality, a feeling beyond words. I like the subtle build-up to Zoro being alive. We see the sky from his view. We see a tight shot of him against no background, unclear if it's real. This panel is a thought, not proof of his presence. We only accept he's truly there when we see him standing within his environment, above the rubble. Also, the way the eye follows each character's gaze and Zoro's sheaths is raw as hell. The imagery of this scene is otherworldly. Zoro, surrounded by white rubble, transitions into Zoro in a blank void, in a realm of thought. Then a panel of him sensing only the rubble that matters to him, that hides his sword, aware of nothing else. Mr. One can only see him from the outside, too distant to understand his actions, while Zoro remains in the void. Time is paused as he thinks about what he saw. We use aspect-to-aspect panel transitions, rare in One Piece, where each panel shows a different angle of the same scene, rather than progressing time. And for the entire sequence, we cannot see Zoro's eyes. As readers, we cannot truly understand his thoughts here. I love the simplicity of Zoro not cutting the leaves, yet cutting the boulder. It isn't emphasized dramatically. It's shown so plainly that you could skim past it and not realize what he's actually done here. It's that simple to him now, in this state. It's almost comical the way Mr. One brings out a brand new technique at the last moment. Shonen fights are often defined by the back and forth of power-ups and new techniques. Mr. One fought that way, even turned the tide back in his favor with his buzzsaws. To gain an advantage, he had to rely on a devil fruit gimmick instead of true strength, as many in the Alabasta saga, from Mr. Five and Miss Valentine to Crocodile himself, did. But Zoro has transcended that, and another devil fruit gimmick cannot save a weakling. What does it matter that Mr. One can ice skate now? The fact that he thinks it will help him shows his failure to understand Zoro and what's about to happen to him. And so the fight ends. Goddamn, what a page. I told you at the start that Mr. One's rectangular posture implied sturdiness. Zoro has co-opted that strength and made it his own, pulled a full reversal. Yet there's a little bit of curvature as the perspective itself is curved, showing us that Zoro is not as incapable of bending as Mr. One. I called out 2 pages where Zoro was above but not larger than Mr. One, and vice versa. Here, he has achieved both, and achieved full dominance. It's a classic samurai manga type of page that Oda uses a ton for Zoro, to not see the clash itself but only the result. This is probably the coolest time Oda has ever drawn it. I love the rhythm to this page. There are 2 motions being set up in the main panel. Mr. One falling, and Zoro sheathing the Wado Ichimonji. We only see one of those actions completed, but the rhythm implies that in that same instant, Mr. One hit the ground. Yet only one of these matters to Zoro and needs to be shown. Now that he has overcome him, Mr. One has fallen out of Zoro's view entirely. I hope you all enjoyed this video. This fight was suggested by a commenter named... well, sorry, I do not know how to pronounce that, but it was a great suggestion. I always appreciate ideas for past chapters to talk about, though I can't guarantee I'll do all of them. It depends on my schedule and what I personally feel like I have something to say about. Talking about classic One Piece paneling is a lot different from talking about the modern stuff. Both are great, but very different. If this video helped you understand more of why you enjoy reading the series, then I've done my job. My goal here isn't to provide an objective view of what's good paneling and what's bad paneling, but to describe my perspective on what I enjoy, in the hopes that other people relate to it. You can love or hate these fights, but let's have more detailed conversations about how they work. I like to talk about One Piece's paneling every week, so if you're interested in that, subscribe. I'd appreciate if you liked the video as well, and I'm still a small enough YouTuber that reading your comments fills me with joy rather than an existential dread of how many people are perceiving my work. So leave a comment, especially if you noticed anything cool about the paneling in this fight that I didn't talk about. Anyway, have a great week. This one was for you, Zoro fans.